Good morning. What I'd like to do today is introduce a gentleman who's somewhat of a legend on the north rim of the Grand Canyon by the name of Uncle Jimmy Owens. Now, if you met Owens on the Kaibab Plateau somewhere around 1900, early 1900s, he'd look about like any cowboy, a floppy hat, vest, pair of Levi's. The thing you would notice that is different about him is he was always accompanied by a pack of hounds. And that's because Teddy Roosevelt had hired him to kill as many mountain lions as they could on the Kaibab Plateau to protect the deer herd. Now, we don't know much about his early life. His obituary said that he was born in 1836, in San Antonio, and that his mother and father were killed in the Battle of the Alamo. Well, there's some problems with this obituary, because if you compare the dates, he would have had to have been born after his mother died. So there are some problems there. So just when was he born? The obituary says 1836. Census Bureau caught up with him in 1910, and he said he was born in 1861. They didn't catch up with him again until the 1930 census. Now he says he was born in 1848. A good friend of his, Annie Dyer Nunn, said he's born in 1857, but then he was asked this question another time, and he was born in 1849. So we don't really know when he was born. Probably sometime in the 1850s or 1860s, making him in his 80s or maybe early 90s when he died, rather than 100. Now, he never married, but he did have a couple of sisters. One of them lived in Claude, Texas, and had two sons, Bill and Bob Vaughn. The other one was a Cox family, which also had a couple of boys, and hence the name Uncle Jimmy. Now, we don't know that Uncle Jimmy ever lived in these two places, but we do know that he lived up the road a ways at the Charles Goodnight Ranch. He started out as a cowboy, eventually worked his way up to foreman of the Goodnight Ranch. And three important things happened to him while he lived there. First of all, this is probably where he learned to hunt mountain lions, because of the fact that they occur in that area, and undoubtedly they kill cattle like they do in other places. He also learned to work buffalo. The Goodnight was very concerned about the demise of buffalo on the Great Plains, and he had started a captive herd. And so Owens was undoubtedly involved in every aspect of the buffalo herd. The third thing was he met this fellow, Charles Buffalo Jones. Jones also had a captive herd of buffalo and had the same concerns that Goodnight did. And he visited the Goodnight Ranch in 1897, where he first met Owens. And at this time, they probably discussed how can you make money off a buffalo herd. Some people sold heads, hides, meat, sold animals for other people that wanted captive herds. But the other thing that they discussed was this animal, a cattle, a cross between a buffalo and domestic cattle. They thought this would make a much hardier animal out on the Great Plains, and also would produce more meat. So they probably at this 1897 meeting discussed this situation of starting a cattle herd. Well, shortly after that, Buffalo Jones took a job at Yellowstone National Park as buffalo keeper. And at this time, the national park was run by the U.S. military. And they didn't know anything about wildlife, let alone buffalo. So they hired someone who was Buffalo Jones, and it wasn't long before he started to have problems. This letter from John Pitcher, who was the commanding officer at Yellowstone, said, "I have several times asked you to select someone who is an expert with a rope, an all-around good Western man who would be in accord with me and not always finding fault." The person he had in mind was Uncle Jimmy Owens, and he convinced Owens in 1903 to come to Yellowstone and join him there in taking care of the buffalo. And it's there where they probably started really formulating perhaps having a cattle herd somewhere. Now, because of that, Jones was making some trips, and Pitcher wrote in this particular note, Jones is currently in Arizona where he is making plans to establish a cattle ranch. So very definitely the plans were being formed. And Jones wasn't just there to look at a cattle ranch. Uncle Jimmy Owens looked at the Kaibab Plateau as a potential game preserve. and he wanted Jones to look at it and tell him if it was suitable, and he did. And he did evidently a pretty good job because he got a special concession. It's been granted to Carl Charles Jones in the Grand Canyon Forest Recreation Area for the purpose of experimenting in the hybridizing of buffalo and cattle, the government to retain a certain percentage of the produce. So Owens and Jones now had a place for their buffalo. The thing is, they needed money. So they got them from some local investors. Edwin Woolley provided the cattle. Ernest Pratt, Benjamin Saunders, and Frank Ascott all chipped in a little money in kind of an unofficial corporation. So now we had the land, we had the money, we needed the buffalo. And they came from a variety of places. Some from Jones's Garden City, Kansas herd, some from the Goodnight Ranch in Texas, some from a senior Malera in Monterey, California, of all places, a couple of bulls from Yellowstone, and some from the Michael Pablo herd in Montana. So all the components were there. The only problem was they had to get the buffalo to the Grand Canyon. And the nearest railhead was in Lund, Utah, some 170 miles from the north rim of the Grand Canyon. 3 cowboys, taking Owens, Jones, and one other individual, trail drove 100 head of buffalo over that 170 miles and lost virtually no animals in doing that. Shows how good of cowboys they were. So by 1906, the cattle operation was underway on the Kaibab Plateau. Unfortunately, by 1909, the experiment was declared a failure for several reasons. Many cows died trying to produce a calf. Cows often aborted bull calves, and if the bull calves were produced, they were often sterile. And one big problem, buffalo cows disliked domestic bulls and tried to avoid them. So consequently, the whole thing was a failure, and the investors looked for ways to recoup their losses. Ascott took the cattle. Jones took some of the buffalo to New Mexico, where he started a herd there. Owens, Woolley, and Saunders kept the remaining buffalo, and eventually Owens bought out Woolley and Saunders and became sole owner of the remaining 20 head that were there. Now, people have always said that Buffalo Jones was responsible for bringing the buffalo to the state of Arizona. However, Jimmy Owens was with him the entire way and probably should get more credit than Buffalo Jones because Jones left after 3 short years. Owens hung in with the buffalo herd for 20 years and is why we have buffalo there today. So what's interesting is that besides working buffalo all the time, he had another job. Teddy Roosevelt had hired him as a forest warden on the Kaibab Plateau with a specific job of trying to kill mountain lions in order to protect the deer herd. Now, to do that, he had to have a pack of hounds, and he probably got some locally, but he raised most of his own dogs. And one dog that was very important to him is this black and white dog on the left there. This dog had a collar, said, "I have been at the killing of 450 lions. My name is Pot Hound." And Pot became a legend in his own right as far as a lion dog. Now, just how many lions did Uncle Jimmy take while he was there? Well, there's a lot of estimates. A gentleman by the name of Nichols at the University of Arizona said he took 500 to 600. Another gentleman, Holman, with a cooperative campaign for the destruction of predatory animals, said he took 200. Pot Hound, of course, said 450. So just how many did he take, we don't know, but it could be higher, especially if he bountied fetuses, which some hunters did. What this would be is, for instance, Buffalo Jones actually killed a female that had 4 fetuses and collected 5 bounties. We don't know if Owens did this, but if he did, certainly that would make the numbers higher. Well, as he did his job, deer numbers began to change. In 1906, it was estimated there were 3,000 to 4,000 deer on the North Kaibab. By 1918, it was estimated 15,000. By 1924, 50 to 100,000 deer was the estimate. And the vegetation really showed the effects. The summer range on the lower left, you can see that the conifers have been hedged by deer. The winter range looked even worse. Let me back up here. Winter range looked even worse, where the vegetation was eaten off as high as a deer could reach standing on its hind legs. And thousands of deer were starving to death every winter. So in order to try to rectify this situation, there was a committee formed called the Kaibab Investigation Committee to make recommendations on how to correct this situation. One was to remove all livestock not owned by local ranchers. There were a lot of animals there that were not permitted. Another was to cut the deer herd in half, and several suggestions on how to do that. One was to capture deer alive and move them to another location. But they found deer were really hard to catch and not a lot of people wanted them. So they talked about allowing sport hunting. This area had not been hunted since 1906 when the game preserve was formed. So they got a hold of the Game and Fish Department and asked them to set a hunting season, which they did. However, it's a very remote area at that time, and very few hunters could get there, and very few deer were killed. So they took the third option to have professional hunters and Forest Service employees to shoot deer. And before this even got underway in 1924, it caused controversy. The Game and Fish Department said that they should be killing the deer because deer belong to the people of the state. The Forest Service, on the other hand, said, no, we should be able to kill them. This argument went clear to the Supreme Court, and it was finally ruled that indeed the Forest Service did have the right to kill deer because it was their mandate to try to protect the vegetation. Now, there was another hunt in 1925, but that was the last one, and since that time, the Game and Fish Department has set hunting seasons on the Kaibab each year. So Uncle Jimmy Owens has been blamed for the big buildup of deer, but that wasn't all that was going on. There were other trappers taking wolves, coyotes, bobcats, even golden eagles. So the entire predator base was being severely impacted. And undoubtedly Owens had a lot to do with it since he was taking a primary deer predator, but he can't be blamed in totally. Now, at this time too, Owens wasn't very well known. He's in a very remote place. That all changed when this guy came along. When Zane Grey was kind of a budding writer at this point, a dentist, very bored, and he went to an evening program put on by Buffalo Jones where he and Owens were capturing lions on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And he thought, hey, this might make an interesting story. So in 1908, he booked a hunt with them, made his way to the north rim, and at this time, they were catching some mountain lions alive. And in some cases, they found out a lion was worth more alive than it was dead. They could sell it to zoos, parks, individuals, that sort of thing. So when he arrived, they were catching lions alive. And the way it worked was they would tree the lion, and then someone would climb up the tree and try to get a rope on it. And you can see there in the lower part of the picture, Buffalo Jones getting up in the tree, getting the rope on. They would then pull the lion out of the tree, tie its legs together, tie its mouth shut, and of all things, load it on a pack horse and take it back to camp. At camp, they would chain it to a tree until it could be sent to wherever the order was. If it was to the north, they had to go probably back to Lund, Utah. To the south, they would actually pack these lions on a pack horse across the Grand Canyon to the south rim where they could be shipped on south from there. Now, Zane Grey did turn this into a book. First came out in Field and Stream magazine called Roping Lions in the Grand Canyon, and eventually came out in hardback also. And suddenly everybody knew about Uncle Jimmy Owens on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And people started to go there for hunts and sightseeing tours, and a variety of people wrote about their experiences or used him for characters in a book. One such person was Marguerite Henry, who had never met Owens, but used him as Uncle Jim in Brighty of the Grand Canyon. Now, about 1919, things began to change because Grand Canyon became a national park. There was now a road being built out from Fredonia out to the rim of the canyon on the north side. And there was a tent camp established near where the headquarters on the north rim are today. And these people could walk along the rim and enjoy the scenery and have a very nice, comfortable place to stay. Now, Owens looked at this and he thought he could capitalize on this idea. So he sent a proposal to the park and said, what I would like to do is provide a camp that you go in by horseback. You take 15 or 20 people. We can take them along the rim in places they can't hike to. and also down the Bright Angel Trail to the Colorado River. And it was a good plan. However, the Park Service turned it down. And the reason it was turned down is because when the park was formed, Fred Harvey Enterprises was given the concession rights. And they did not want to have another concessionaire in the park. So Stephen Mather, the director of the National Park Service, who knew Owens well, said, I'm going to see if I can arrange a temporary permit for you. He also was concerned about Owens' buffalo. And he said, I think it would be a fine thing if you would keep the buffalo during your lifetime and then will the herd with the understanding that it'd be known as the James T. Owens herd to the National Park Service. Well, he evidently never willed it to them. And he also did not like the idea of a one-year temporary permit. He wanted something more permanent with that. So he continued in his guide business into the 1920s, but his hearing began to fail. And by 1927, Uncle Jimmy Owens had caught his last mountain lion. However, he needed some way to make money, and he turned to the only thing he had left, and that was his buffalo herd. And he offered the buffalo herd to the state of Arizona, 100 head for some $10,000. The Game and Fish Department wanted this to be a hunted herd, so they tried to raise the money, but they only came up with about $4,000. So they got together with Owens, and they made an arrangement that there would be 15 buffalo killed each year for a couple of years, and the meat, the head, the hide, and a little bit of meat would go to the hunter, but the rest of the meat would go into Phoenix to be sold. And it wasn't long before buffalo meat began to show up in the markets. And I want you to notice this Bayless ad. It says, we are selling buffalo meat without profit to us. All of the buffalo meat was sold without profit, and that's how the other $6,000 was raised to help purchase the buffalo. So, as Owen got older, he'd been there for well over 20 years, but his health was failing, and in his nephew John Cox moved him to Afton, New Mexico. Now, he died there in 1936 of heart failure. So the question came up, where is Uncle Jimmy buried? So we started to look a little bit. We checked the cemeteries in Fredonia and here in Kanab, and couldn't find him. So we thought, well, let's do an electronic search of all of the tombstones in El Paso, Texas, or Las Cruces, New Mexico, which were the nearest two cities to Afton, New Mexico. Again, we couldn't find him. Where was Uncle Jim buried? So we got a hold of his death certificate to see if it said, and sure enough, it said he was buried in the Masonic Cemetery in Las Cruces, New Mexico. The question came up, how in the world did we miss this? So we went to the cemetery, and sure enough, there's a cemetery record, and it said he was buried in Lot 5, Lot 22. So we went to that location, and lo and behold, Uncle Jimmy Owens was buried in an unmarked grave far from his beloved Kaibab. So we got a hold of a few folks that were interested in Uncle Jimmy Owens, and we said, this man ought to have a tombstone. And so within hours, we had enough money to purchase a tombstone. We didn't put a birth date because of the confusion for that, but he died May 11th, 1936. And in November 16th of 2013, we officially dedicated the stone with a group of history lovers and some people that helped purchase it. And this brought to an end the Uncle Jimmy Owens story. Thank you.